Vanu was looking up, away from the platform, and towards the nebula itself, as might a creature of the deep stare toward the distant lights of the surface. The pastel ceiling was intercut with dark bands and splashes of vari-colored luminosity, violets, pinks, and yellows, shapes that echoed her inner turmoil, the fires of space frozen in time. Lashed to the extended flat platform, on both sides of where her magsols clamped her in place, were machines, behemoths from an antique era. Her magsols soundlessly clamped and unclamped from the metallic surface in a timed dance as she shifted her feet in place, restless as usual. The platform gave the appearance of a vast institute lying on the floor of some sea, but of course the annex was free floating in space, a different kind of ocean. It's called Plenum, the First Book of Deo. It's actually the first volume of a 15-book series that I'm in the process of developing. This one deals with a young, neutral-gendered individual who is struggling with issues of identity and sexuality and faith. And so it's a kind of exploration of all those different things. It takes place in the far future, so it's kind of interesting to place religion in a context in the far future. And it deals with the sort of events that transpire because of actions that she undertakes that eventually cause fairly important consequences in her own life and those of the people who are close to her. So it's a kind of space opera, but because it takes place in spaceships and on space platforms, but it is a very human story through this. It's not militaristic or anything like that. It's very human oriented. But I am interested in how technology changes us as people. And so the book investigates, to some extent, a massive number of very extreme technologies that completely change the way people function. And so that provides the sort of background within which this operates. So for instance, we talked about in the presentation about a bodysuit with textures that change dynamically on the surface of the person. But we also had a character who was standing outside in the vacuum. So that is made possible by some of the technology. So it's not the kind of thing that you would normally see in science fiction because the technologies are drastic, they're radical. Well, I took the tendencies that I see today, so I sort of, the whole book is based on a projection, based on the idea that one develops biotechnology and nanotechnology, and the two merge into something that I call BINAC, which is short for bio-nano. So they are a kind of projection into the future. Because a lot of science fiction deals with near future, so the ecological crisis that we're facing. But I'm very interested in the far future and the long-term visioning, because I think for humanity to get out of this trouble we're in now, we need to have a long view, not a short view. And so I'm interested in developing these longer views of where things could go. There's a spiritual aspect too. Again, an area that's rarely dealt with in science fiction. Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of exploration of the spiritual dimension. Even there's kind of a tension between issues like doctrine and practice. So how does a religion's doctrine sometimes not always line up with the practice? So these kinds of issues are part of what's studied in the book. Vanu is a gender-neutral individual. In my universe, I have 7 So they're called 7 genders, but I think in modern terminology we would say 7 sexes. Because sex and gender are somewhat different ideas. Vanu is a gender neutral, is a neutral sex character. And I have a kind of a gender fluidity in my own makeup. So I'm drawn to characters that mix up the genders to some extent. And Vanu was perhaps the first one that I did with that kind of a combination. I shift words slightly based on their actual changed use. And I usually shift them once, work with it for a while, until I realize that the word isn't quite working, and then I adjust it. And I do this several times. So the words have a kind of organic quality to them, even when they're shifted. And one of the reviewers for the book remarked on the fact that the shifted language is not too difficult to do because the words feel very organic. So as I mentioned, this is a 15-book saga. The 15 books exist in draft form. They're in the process of being revised. I think you're my editor on one of the books, on the second book in the series, and I'm in the process of finishing up the third book in the series. So these things are moving forward in terms of publishing.
And that means that Vanu, the main character of Plenum, First Book of Deo, we're going to see here again.
Yeah, so the 15 books is 5 trilogies, and so what I'm publishing to begin with is the first books of each trilogy. And the Vanu story is taken up in the second book of Deo, but that won't be out for a couple of years because I have all these other books to publish between now and then.
So we have to be patient.
You have to be patient.
That may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.